Well, I suppose I must bear some responsibility for the fact that we don't have a chairman sitting between us. I'm trying to pioneer a new method of public conversation in which we have a chairman to introduce us, a chairman to stop us promptly when we've gone too far, and I hope he will do that, I hope Mark will do that, but not a chairman to actually moderate the discussion itself, because I'm sure this wouldn't have happened with Mark Kay, but in my experience, having a chairman on the stage between two conversationalists spoils the conversation, because just when it's getting going, the chairman will change the subject. It's even worse when there are, say, 4 people on the panel, and there's a good conversation going between person A and person B, and just when person B is about to retort to person A, the chairman will jump in and say to person C, and what do you think about this? And that completely derails the entire thing. Another thing that's even worse is the debate format. 20 minutes for the proposition, 20 minutes for the opposition, 5 minutes rebuttal, 5 minutes rebuttal. It's all derived from lawyers. Like so much else. So that's just my introduction to the format. In a way, apology. It throws an onus upon us to keep the conversation going, and so we're going to do our best. Lawrence.
Well, the other thing we want to let you know is that, as Mark alluded, we've already had a rather public dialogue that appeared in Scientific American, and actually an extended version is online, and I encourage you to look at that. But we also therefore decided that we would not try and reproduce that dialogue here because it's accessible to you. So we've assured that would be the case by making absolutely no preparations whatsoever for this event, and that may or may not be obvious. We'll see. But I'm going to begin by asking you, Richard, about your own philosophy about education. What drives your interest in public education and the techniques you use?
My job is Charles Simone Professor of the Public Understanding of Science at Oxford, and the benefactor, Charles Simone, explicitly wanted me to promote science to the general public, rather than, for example, do research on how many people think the sun goes around the earth, or how many people don't know why we have a winter and a summer, that kind of thing. I mean, that's very interesting research, and you'd be shocked by the results.
In fact, well, absolutely. In fact, you should know that 50% of the American public, every year the National Science Foundation has asked this question, do not get the answer right to the question, the Earth goes around the sun and takes a year to do it, true or false? And as I like to say, we know who that 50% vote for, but in any case, but anyway.
There's a similar 50% who think that the world is 6,000 years old. And as I've said before, if you actually work out the scale of the error, it's equivalent to believing that the distance from New York to San Francisco is 7.8 yards. Anyway, as I was saying, the Charles Simone Professor of Public Understanding of Science could devote himself or herself to, I say himself or herself, I'm retiring this year, and so my job is being advertised, and looking forward to seeing who gets it. It could have been devoted to that, or could have been devoted to, say, teaching how to communicate science. But the benefactor asked me to do it by promoting science. I think there are 2 main ways of thinking about science as an educationist. And I can illustrate it by talking about 2 approaches to space. There's the Carl Sagan approach to space, which is the sort of, isn't it wonderful? And that's my approach. And then there's what I call the non-stick frying pan approach, which is, oh, we must support NASA because non-stick frying pans were developed as a byproduct of... and that's an extreme, but nevertheless, when I'm asked to justify science education, I do not, as some people do, leap first for the, oh, it's useful. For example, why preserve the Amazon rainforest? Oh, because we might be able to get drugs from the bark of trees. Maybe we can, but that's not why I want to preserve the Amazon rainforest. So I'm the Carl Sagan, the wonder of space, the beauty of the universe, the awe-inspiring nature of deep space, deep time, of deep complexity in biology. I don't go for exploding custard, whiz-bangs, and things like that.
Well, okay, that's a really good point you pointed out, because my area of research is in something that, in all fairness, has absolutely no practical utility whatsoever. And the thing is, I'm often asked to apologize for that, and it is interesting to me that people ask, you know, what's the point of doing that if it's not useful? But they never ask that, or very rarely do they ask that about art or literature or music. It's not, those things are not going to produce a better toaster. And for me, I have to agree with you completely that the most fascinating thing about science is the ideas, is the lifting of the human spirit. And we remember the Greeks not for their plumbing, or the Romans not particularly for their plumbing, but largely for their ideas. And why we have to justify that when we talk about science amazes me. And there's a quote that I like to use from the first head of the Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory, which is a particle accelerator. Right now, in fact, it's the most energetic particle accelerator in the world, soon to be surpassed by a machine in Geneva, as may be many things about this country. And he was asked to testify before Congress, and he said, they asked him, would this aid in the defense of the nation? A typical thing. And he said, no, but it'll help keep the nation worth defending.
Yes. Okay.
And I think that's really important. Yeah, well, you can applaud for he's unfortunately deceased, but I'll let him know that. But the other thing, though, that I have to say behind my philosophy of reaching out, and I know we have talked about this before a little bit, I believe in trying to explain the wonderful and mysterious nature of the universe, which is far more mysterious and interesting than any science fiction writer could ever come up with. But in order to get people to be receptive to that awe, I think you have to do a little work. When for some reason or other, get asked to talk to teachers a lot, and I tell them that I think the biggest mistake that any teacher makes is to assume their students are interested in what they have to say. Now, it's actually true. It's true for it doesn't have to be a teacher. It could be car salesman, politician, anyone. I really do think you have to work and reach people where they are before they'll even be receptive, because they won't understand how it relates to anything they're interested in. So when I'm trying to reach people about science, I try to go to where they are in some sense, or work very hard. And that was the purpose behind the Star Trek book, for example. People, I think as a biologist, maybe you have this happen less to you than I do as a physicist, but when people ask me at a party, what do you do? And I say, well, I'm a physicist. And then they say, well, how about the baseball season? And
I'm shocked. I'm horrified by that.
Yeah, I know it. It's true. But then you say, well, what about time travel or something like that? And then people realize they're fascinated by those ideas, but they don't make the leap and realize in some sense that that's science, that the things that intrinsically fascinate people are really the things that we're lucky enough to be able to, in general, be paid to do. And so I think one has to try and find a hook. And as I say, in biology, you may not have found the hook, although the hook, in this case, one of the big interests, of course, is evolution, and it's kind of an anti-hook nowadays, and at least in the United States, the fact that evolution is so fascinating as an idea, and I think, by the way, that we physicists are also largely to blame in many ways for the fact that Darwin isn't appreciated more than he is. We did a wonderful public relations campaign for Albert Einstein, but I have to say, as I, over the last few years, have spent time in the public debate about evolution versus intelligent design, I really do think that if I had to pick the greatest scientist of the last few hundred years, it would be Charles Darwin and not Albert Einstein. That a single person could so radically change an entire field, and combining observation and theory just amazes me. And we really should be promoting what a remarkable human achievement that was.
Well, I think that is right. One way to put it is that the ratio between that which a theory explains as the numerator and that which you need to assume in order to explain it as the denominator, Darwin wins out on that. I mean, what Darwin explains is everything about life: human life, animal life, plant life, the diversity of life, the complexity of life. Everything is explained by one simple idea. It's an idea so simple that you can express it, actually, I think, in a single word: heredity. Once you've got, on a planet anywhere in the universe, high-fidelity replication of coded information. I think everything else then follows. You'd probably need to add a little bit more than that. On the other hand, when you compare the achievement of an Einstein with a Darwin, a Newton with a Darwin, I think you need to be a lot brighter to be an Einstein. I mean, you know, any fool could have been a Darwin. Let me clarify that. It's somewhat baffling to me why we had to wait for our Darwin until the middle of the 19th century, 200 years after we had to wait for our Newton. You would think that the idea of evolution by natural selection could have occurred to any philosopher in an armchair from the Greeks onward. Not one of them got it, not a single one of them got it.
But I think that for me it's funny that you say that. Maybe the grass is always greener on the other side, but I think as a physicist how much harder it would be to have been Darwin. My mother wanted me to be a doctor, and I realized I couldn't, partly because classification was not, when I grew up, biology was classification, unfortunately. And I realized that that's just something I couldn't do very well. And I think, well, you probably know more about this than I do, but observation was such a key part of what Darwin did that I don't know if, I mean, of course, after the fact, anyone could have had the idea. And one says that about many things in science. After the fact, it's a lot easier to understand where it came from. But having the idea, I think Darwin, it's so beautiful yet so subtle that although his expedition on the Beagle and all the years he spent observing things was an essential part of ramming into the skull of someone who, after all, evolution is everywhere, but at the same time it's nowhere. It requires an understanding of cosmic time in a way that is essential to understand what's here and now. And of course the same is true about, in some sense, astrophysics, but the fact that many people are comfortable thinking about the cosmos in grand scales, but thinking about our own selves in that way and understanding, I mean, one of the big problems of people understanding evolution is this realization that the Earth has been around a hell of a long time, and so has life, and without that cosmic time, the concept of evolution would clearly be wrong.
Yes, you have to be able to grasp the immensity of geological time. It's interesting, by the way, that Darwin was almost scooped by Alfred Wallace, and both of them, they were very similar. They had very similar careers. They were both naturalists. They both traveled the world. They both spent a lot of time in the tropics, alone, free to think. Wallace actually had the idea in a fever dream. In a moment of lucidity in the middle of having a high fever with malaria. I love that story. I mean, I love the thought that it took a kind of fermenting high temperature in a brilliant man's brain to get this idea.
It'd be good to know what other thoughts he had at the same time.
I know, yeah.
Anyway, so.
But nevertheless, the idea, when you grasp it, as you say, it is very simple, whereas Einstein and quantum theory, you no doubt understand them. I don't, and I bet most people here don't understand them, because it seems to me to be much further from what the human brain is set up to comprehend. I mean, perhaps we ought to talk about that, actually, but maybe not now. But
yeah, it'd be fun to talk about that a little bit. I think I'd agree with you. Certain things like quantum mechanics, no one understands. We do it, but we don't understand it. And that's vitally important, I think. There's certain things we will never have an intuitive understanding of, and it probably relates to evolution. It probably relates to the fact that we're classical beings, and the way the world behaves at a fundamental level is just something that we have no direct or even, well, no direct experience of. We can try and build up an indirect understanding, but it works. But it is so counterintuitive to realize that at a fundamental scale, objects are doing many things at the same time, whereas
going through two slits, for example.
Yeah, going through both slits at the same time, or a lot more than both slits. And we exploit that, and as I say, maybe we'll talk about that. But the interesting thing is, I guess, that to me, it's not so clear that at least evolution, and well, you get male, I get male, and it's obviously not intuitively clear to many people that what evolution is. I was telling you just before this, I got a letter last night because I was doing something that happened to be on TV from a woman who said to me, well, okay, I don't know if she said she liked watching me on TV, but she said she did. And, but she said, now, I just want to know one thing. Who decided which ape would evolve and which wouldn't? But I think that's the kind of immediacy people have, and the confusion people have with evolution is a sense that that's exactly how it works, instead of working with populations. And so it is, this beautiful idea is still one step removed from our direct experience, and I think that's one of the reasons why, just one of the reasons why people are so many people are so abjectly opposed to it. It appears to go against what their direct experience. I think there's much more to it than that, but.
Ernst Mayr, the grand old man of the neo-Darwinian synthesis, who died at the age of 100 a couple of years ago, he put it down to essentialism, the modern name for what people like Plato, I mean, one could call it the dead hand of Plato. Essentialism means people think there's an essence of rabbit, an essence of rhinoceros. I mean, a rabbit is a rabbit is a rabbit, and rabbits have the same sort of eternal verity as triangles to Euclid. And I mean, maybe all the Greeks like that thought like geometers.
Yeah.
And so a rabbit was a thing which kind of hanging out there in space, the ideal rabbit. And so the idea of a rabbit evolving into anything else, or an ape evolving into anything else, is utterly foreign. But it seems to me that that's a different and much smaller order of foreignness than the idea of a particle going through two slits, and in some sense knowing whether I forget what you have to explain the thing.
It's absolutely ridiculous what particles do when they go through two slits. It's,
yes.
No, I mean because well, okay, we'll do this now. So when I throw a baseball, I'm a big baseball fan. When I throw a baseball, it takes a known trajectory usually, and ends up in a catcher's hand. And we can calculate that, and we force students through endless, boring calculations to calculate that. But when you throw an electron, of course, it doesn't do that. It does everything at once. It takes every possible way to get from one place to another, all at the same time. And we can demonstrate that with a wonderful experiment that actually was first performed by someone who was both a doctor and a physicist, Thomas Young, and who also. It's amazing what they did then. He also was one of the people that was essential in decoding the hieroglyphics. But an electron, when you send it out, and there are two slits, will go through both at the same time and interfere with itself when it comes out the other end, and therefore produce a very strange pattern on the other side of the slits. Now, if you say, well, look, this is ridiculous. The electron either went through one slit or the other. So I'll watch it. And you turn on a light, or an electron detector, and you watch it, and indeed, the electron does, each electron goes through one slit or the other. And you say, aha, but then you look behind the slit, and when you're watching it, the pattern is different. Having watched it, having measured it, you change the pattern. And so you know it was doing something very different when you weren't watching it. And that is very objectionable. And in fact, Einstein never, as you know, never came around to accepting that as a fact of life, and it is truly one of the strange. Relativity is much simpler to understand. Quantum mechanics is profoundly unnerving because of that, and it has many philosophical implications that many people are still disturbed about. And we're trying to understand. In fact, my own field, something I'm just working on, involves trying to understand if the universe is quantum mechanical. What does a measurement mean? Because if you're an external observer turning a light on an electron, then you can understand that you might affect it. But if the universe as a whole is a quantum mechanical system, which it surely is if quantum mechanics governs it, then what does it mean if you're inside of it? And one of the pictures that people use to guide themselves now, which is called the many worlds interpretation, which is just ridiculous, is that every time I look out at you, I force you to be in a specific configuration, just like that electron. But there's an infinite number of other universes that are existing at the same time in which, one of you is up here and I'm in the audience. And they're all coexisting at the same time. And so every time we make an observation, this quantum wave function of the universe branches into an infinite number. And it's just, and that infinity keeps multiplying. And it's really It's probably the only classical way to understand what's happening, but it's so ridiculous that I think that most people wouldn't accept, and I'm not sure most physicists
Well,
accept it.
you say it's ridiculous, but I mean, so is the alternative ridiculous. I mean, it's almost as though you need a ridiculous theory to understand this ridiculous observation.
Well, actually, that's a good point. That's a good point. I hadn't thought of that. That's actually
Well, if you take the Copenhagen interpretation of the, say, Schrödinger's cat, it's completely ridiculous, but then so is the many worlds interpretation completely ridiculous.
Well, that's what's great about quantum mechanics, is every interpretation is completely ridiculous,
yes.
I guess. Yeah.
Well, we got into this by comparing it with Darwin's achievement, and however you might say there's a certain foreignness about understanding Darwinism, you've got to get your mind from a timescale of seconds, minutes, years, decades, perhaps centuries, which we're quite accustomed to. You've got to switch to hundreds of millions of years. Well, that's difficult, but it's not difficult in the same league as the quantum difficulty.
And that brings up something interesting, which is that, so you mentioned quantum theory. And so we don't have people going to schools and demanding that it's a theory after all. And
only a theory. Only a theory.
Yeah, it's only a theory after all. But somehow, when it comes to evolutionary theory, people say, "Well, it's just a theory." In fact, I was just about to tell you before, during the stage before we came out, an amazing thing that happened. It's a wonderful thing that happened. I don't know if you're aware of the news in Florida. Every now and then, something good comes out of Florida, and so there was a big fight about introducing evolution in the schools, and in fact, eventually the legislature or the school board agreed to allow evolution to be, in fact, require evolution to be introduced, but with the statement, the scientific theory of evolution. And the people who had agreed to that, of course, were the people who like to say, well, good, now the word theory is there, and we can make it appear to be suspect. But the great thing that just happened, and I'm just so thrilled with this, is that the school board said, okay, but we are also requiring it to be called the scientific theory of electromagnetism, the scientific theory of quantum mechanics. And so now, finally, it's put on the same, people can understand that in science, when you use the word theory, it's very different than when we use it in common parlance. So it's a great success, although it was meant to be.
Yeah, that's very good. But let's ask the question, why has evolution especially suffered from this? Because, I mean, is it because people think they can understand it? I mean, Jacques Monod, the great French molecular biologist, said the curious thing about natural selection is that everybody thinks he understands it. And they clearly don't. But is it that because people think they understand it, and therefore their skepticism is aroused, where they know they haven't a prayer of understanding quantum theory, so it doesn't, I mean, just it's off the radar, and so they don't express skepticism about it?
I think it's more than that. I think there's an immediacy of evolution because it puts humans on the same, at some level, as all other animals. And we're going to be bound to get to this, so we may as well start now. I happen to think really evolution is a straw man. It's really the attack on evolution, in this country at least, and I think largely elsewhere, is based on a fundamental fear of science. A fear that science is immoral because it doesn't explicitly mention God. Because God is not an explicit part of our discussions. And because God is not an explicit part of our discussions, therefore, it must be immoral. And that's why all these people are not so much trying to attack evolution per se, is to say what we want to do is, in fact, have a theistic understanding imposed upon science classes so that scientific materialism, which has led, if you look at the literature of these people, has led to all the evil things in the world, is now turned into a moral subject. So I think it's this immediacy that it's the biggest slap in the face to some people.
Yeah, but why wouldn't physics have that same effect?
No, because I think it's not so personal, which is one of the reasons why I think many people are more intimidated by physics, is because it's not so personal. Biology, I think it's one of the reasons biology is taught first in high schools, which I think is a huge mistake. And in fact, me and a physicist named Leon Letterman were working to try to get physics taught first, not because we like physics better, but because the reason maybe one of the reasons I'm not a doctor is that, you know, I was taught biology and I had to memorize all this stuff. And but in fact, of course, physics is the basis of chemistry, and chemistry is the basis of biology. So if you really want to understand biology, at some level, you should understand things like energetics and mechanisms. And so I think, but the reason biology is taught first, I think, is that many people feel, because it's about things you can see and touch and immediate things, it's much more intuitive and much more friendly. But at the same time, it's much more terrifying to, in some sense, for some people, to say that humans are on exactly the same plane at some level as every other animal that's ever walked across the earth. And for you, and you said it's a good thing that it attacks that belief that some people have that humans are special and different. But for those other people, they'd say that's why science is bad. It shouldn't attack that because we are divinely inspired, and we have been, and God has created us in her image.
Within biology,
it's all right. That was pandering.
Okay,
that was pandering. It's okay. Don't. No.
Within biology, the order is wrong as well. Evolution is taught last, at least it is in Britain. And so many people get to the end of their biological education never having learned about evolution. That means they learn all about facts, just like you did as a doctor when you weren't becoming a doctor. Yeah. They learn all about lots and lots of facts, lists and lists of facts, and not the slightest inkling of the explanation. And the explanation has been with us for 150 years, 149 years, and it should come first, because otherwise you're learning facts without any rationale, without any sense of what it's for. And the rationale is so beautiful and so elegant, and actually so easy to understand, I think.
Well, let me ask you in this regard to that, because would you... are we making a mistake by calling evolution a theory? I mean, evolution is a fact. It's natural selection, perhaps, is a theory.
If you look up the word theory in the Oxford Dictionary, you'll find two main definitions. One is the only a theory one, as in, it's just a hypothesis, nobody knows for sure, it's just a theory. The other one is a body of knowledge which is coherent and which is taken to be factual, which is taken to be factual until maybe something better comes along. But there's so the theory of gravitation, Einstein's theory, quantum theory, and evolutionary theory. And clearly scientists are using it in that sense, whereas lay people, eagerly egged on by unscrupulous creationist propaganda, are taking it in the hypothetical sense.
So you're comfortable calling evolution a theory? I mean, it seems to me if I look around, the facts of evolution are obvious, but the question...
Well, no, I would call it a fact. I think that we're playing the wrong game by using the philosophically sophisticated term theory. Since the other side is playing the game of using the colloquial term. The colloquial term for what evolution is fact.
Yeah.
It is a fact.
Yeah, exactly.
And
I'm all in favor of that.
It's a fact in the same sense as that's a table.
Yeah, exactly. Or the earth goes around the sun.
If you're going to get sophisticated and philosophical, no doubt it's only a theory that that's a table.
Yeah, yeah.
There are sense data pouring in which so far have failed to falsify the hypothesis that that's a table. And in the colloquial sense, if ever the word fact should ever be used, then it's used of the fact that that's a table, and it should be used of the fact that we are that we share a common ancestor with monkeys, that we share a common ancestor with sea squirts and starfish and bacteria. That is a fact in the ordinary language sense of a fact. Now, natural selection is a theory for what has driven evolution in adaptive directions, that for what has put together the powerful illusion of design, which nobody could fail to notice. It's not the only thing that drives evolution. I mean, much of evolutionary change is driven by random genetic drift, by the so-called neutral theory of molecular genetics. But natural selection is the only theory that's ever been proposed, and I think that ever will be proposed, that's capable of accounting for the illusion of design which we see around us. So I'm not quite sure whether... Darwin thought that both natural selection and evolution itself were theories in the tentative hypothetical sense, and he spent most of his life gathering evidence for them. I think now we've reached the point where the fact of evolution is a fact, and nobody could seriously doubt it. there is still controversy over the theory that natural selection is the dominant driving force. I think nobody would doubt that it's the dominant driving force of adaptive evolution, but many people, including me, doubt that it's the dominant driving force of all evolution as measured at the molecular level.
Maybe we'll get to that too, because I wanted to ask you about in this country there's these fake controversies that have been invented in a lot of different areas, but particularly the people at places like the Discovery Institute and elsewhere have tried to put forward. It's this beautiful. I got into probably publicly talking about this in this country when in Ohio they were about to introduce the requirement in some sense that intelligent design be taught alongside evolution. And there was a debate that the Board of Education set up down in Columbus before the public and the board, and I was asked, because I'd written something about this in the paper, asked to be on this along with another scientist who happens to be a religious biologist, Ken Miller, and then two members of the Discovery Institute. And we all thought that, I mean, I agree with you, by the way, not only do I not like the debate format, but in science it's actually very disingenuous.
Yeah.
Because first of all, it doesn't happen that way most of the time, but secondly, it gives the impression, and I'm sure you've had this, a lot of people want to be on stage to debate me about evolution or about alien abduction or whatever it is, because if you're reasonably presentable and your arguments are interesting, someone who's out there in the audience who doesn't necessarily know what's happening will come away from it in the end saying, well, you know, he said, she said, it sounded reasonable on both sides. And so at that debate, I made it quite clear at the beginning that this was not representative, that if it had been representative, there would have been 10,000 scientists on one side of the table and two representatives of a wacky fringe group on the other side of the table. But it's very important. But we thought that they were going to get up and say, all the reasons why intelligent design should be taught. But they're really brilliant, and they have much better marketing than scientists do for the most part. And one of the slimiest of them, who happens to be a philosopher, got up and a rather intelligent man, he said, you know what, we don't want to force that. We're open-minded. We don't want you to require you to teach intelligent design. We just want you to teach the controversy. Now, what a brilliant statement. That was the first time it was used in this country. And it's brilliant because, of course, it's like asking, when did you stop beating your wife? I mean, you can't, the minute you say it, it presumes there's a controversy, and it's brilliant because most people in this country believe that evolution is incredibly controversial, and in fact, I don't know if you know one of these statistics that's really scary. If you ask Americans, and this was done in a poll last year, forget that most Americans don't believe in evolution, at least when asked about it. That's true. By far the majority don't believe in it. But they were asked, if, independent of what you believe, what should be taught in schools? Okay? 12% said evolution, only. 24% said creationism, only. And the rest of Americans were, like to be open-minded, teach everything. So it's much scarier, in fact, than you might think otherwise.
Yes. Well, it sounds so reasonable, doesn't it? I mean, by the way, there are all sorts of creation myths that you could teach. I mean, you could have hundreds of different ones. I mean, I think maybe one way to retaliate is to say, well, let's teach the controversy about reproduction, and let's have equal time for the sex theory of reproduction and the stork theory of...
No, in fact, that's perfect. I think that's that's an example of when we talk about science education, which is what you try to do. Let's bring this to an example that people can internalize and respond to. And in fact, I use the same example. In this country, there's, people, it's really resonated because people think we should be open-minded. But when I point out, well, look, in that National Science Foundation survey that I talked to you about, 50% of the American public does not know the Earth goes around the sun and takes a year to do it. So therefore, in physics class, if we're worried about being open-minded, and half the American public doesn't believe that, in physics classes, shouldn't we spend equal amount of time on the Earth-centered cosmology?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And when you put it that way, people realize that's clearly nonsense, and it brings home the key point, which is that the purpose of education is actually not to validate ignorance, but to overcome it.
Yeah.
And so if we're and that's the onus on scientists. If people don't understand these things, it means we're doing a bad job. And we have to do a better job. It doesn't mean we should do a worse job. And I think all of these things do reflect the fact that we as scientists, obviously you and I spend a lot of our time in one way or another trying to counteract that, but we as scientists are not doing a good job at explaining what we're doing or why we're doing it. And so I guess let me ask you a question, because one thing, you know, when we've compared our different techniques of trying to reach people, and you know, I've argued that I have some problems sometimes with the approach you've taken, because I think well, I have had some. We can talk about that, and maybe we will. But the point is that if we continue to alienate, as scientists seem to do, the public, then we shouldn't be surprised if they don't support science. And so the question is how to overcome that. And I wanted to ask you the following question: which is more important to you, disabusing people of false notions, or convincing them to try and learn about the real things?
I'm always getting this problem. It's
I know, and that's why I brought it up.
Yeah. It's this matter of seduction and...
which is a word I've used,
which is your word.
Trouble because of
and I had a little exchange with Neil deGrasse Tyson at the Beyond Belief conference, and he took me to task in very much the same terms as you have. I suppose in the particular case of the evolution-creation controversy, where I have been accused of rocking the boat and of spoiling the case for our side in the education debate, it was put to me most starkly by Rothschild, who is the lead lawyer for our side in the Dover, Pennsylvania case. And we had lunch together, we got on very well, and we talked a lot. And then at the end he said, well, thank goodness we didn't call you as an expert witness. And he was absolutely right. I would have been a disaster as an expert witness, because the lawyer for the other side would simply have said, Mr. Dawkins, is it true that you came to your atheism through evolution? And I would have had to say yes. And then he would have simply have said, my case rests, yes, because that's enough to damn it. So the seduction technique there would be to go out to people and say, look, I respect your religion. I think your religion's great, but your religion is perfectly compatible with evolution. And you can believe, if you like, that God set evolution going. Maybe God helps evolution over some of the difficult jumps,
I don't know. You know, so I don't think. Obviously, I have been accused of the seduction side, and which I'm proud of. But I think the point is that you have to. You don't have to go bend over backwards that much. But I think that the largest impact I've ever had is going to fundamentalist colleges and saying just simply a simple statement that you don't have to be an atheist to believe in evolution.
Yeah.
And that is so... I've had kids come up to me and say, I've never heard anyone say that. I always thought you had to.
How could they possibly not have heard anyone say that? Did they ever talk to a clergyman, a bishop, an archbishop?
The clergy... No, you see, this isn't the Church of England.
Okay.
This is... No, it's true. These kids, every Sunday, from the time they're too young to think, and that's why both you and I absolutely agree that I think it's sort of child abuse to subject children to that. But they are told that. They are told that in this country, and that is why many of them just have this gut reaction, because if I have to be an atheist to believe in evolution, I clearly am not going to believe in evolution because it's a threat to my belief. But if you just tell them it doesn't require that, then it is eye-opening and useful. At the same time, I think it's disingenuous not to point out that there are tensions, and our mutual friend Stephen Weinberg, another physicist, has put it, I think, most eloquently by saying science doesn't make it impossible to believe in God. It just makes it possible to not believe in God.
Yes. Well, I want to go further than that. I think that as you were talking then, I thought I could put it exactly the other way around. You can go to these people in their churches, fundamentalist churches, and you say, look, you don't have to be an atheist to believe in evolution. Now, if your aim is to propagandize in favor of evolution, that obviously is the best seduction technique. But if your aim is to kill religion, as mine is, then just let me finish. If your aim is to kill religion, then since evolution is manifestly true, then if there are people out there who really believe that that if you are an evolutionist, you've got to be an atheist, then all I've got to do is to persuade them of evolution, which should be comparatively easy, since the evidence is overwhelming, and I'll turn them all into atheists.
Yeah, well, yeah, that was, okay. But here's why, you know, I was thinking about this last night, comparing our different approaches, which a lot of people have compared in different contexts. But I really think the reason, actually, I've come to appreciate much more than I had before your approach in the times we've interacted, which really is one of raising consciousness. You've said that many times. Yeah. And I really think that is vitally important. And my own consciousness has been raised by you in many ways, and not just in the times we've talked, but in your writing. But I think, I don't think you're convincing many people to be atheists. What you're doing is convincing people who are receptive to those ideas already not to be afraid to have those ideas in public, which I think is very important. So in some sense, I think we're speaking to complementary groups. At some level, the resonance, the number of copies your book has sold, I think is an example that you're really reaching people who are sympathetic, but in some sense needed ammunition and an understanding and a coherent picture of this. And so I think that the approach you're taking works extremely well and is vitally important for those people who are receptive. And I guess the approach I've tried to take most recently is the approach for people who aren't receptive, and that's seduction. Yeah. And that's to say, and the end result may be hoping that they might think one way or another about God, but it actually isn't. It really is hoping that they'll just open their minds enough to realize that the real world, the world as it actually is not evil. It's neither good nor evil, but it's remarkable. And the way to understand the physical world is to use science. And so I think we're really actually speaking at different audiences. I'm not convinced, in fact, I'm pretty convinced that, and maybe you can give me counterexamples, that the confirmed, deeply faithful probably resent and close their minds to what you're saying so early that you're really not turning them around. What you're doing is a very important task, which is to point out that, look, there's a large body of the American public, and it may be a minority, but it's a bigger minority than many individual religions that actually don't believe in God, and it's about time that politicians understood that. And in fact, this really came home to me during this presidential election, and one of the reasons I've been trying to get this debate to happen, yeah. And I'm pleased to say Richard's wearing one of our pins, as I'm wearing one of his. But that when Mitt Romney gave this speech, which was supposed to be the equivalent of a speech that John Kennedy had given many years earlier about the separation of church and state, and his speech was exactly the opposite. In fact, the speech basically said, there is no room in the state for those that don't go to church. Yeah. And
doesn't matter which church you go to, as long as you go to one.
And for that, it's vitally important that you raise the consciousness of the media and politicians and of individuals that there are a large bunch of people who don't believe in God, and they're not bad, they're not worse, they're not anything. And so it's vitally important, but I do think we're speaking to different audiences, and I wanted to see what you thought.
I think that's fine, and maybe that's the right way to go about it. I mean, there are these two audiences, they both need speaking to. I think I compared it a couple of days ago to the good cop, bad cop.
Exactly. Yeah. My wife, who was in the audience, says the first time I've ever been called a good cop.
Well, I was the bad cop until Christopher Hitchens came along. And
well, you know, so do you think Christopher Hitchens goes too far? I'll put you on.
He's one of the most eloquent people I've ever heard.
Yes.
He has a thrilling voice, like Richard Burton. I'd hate to have him on the other side of me in any argument. If we ever talked about the Iraq War, I'd be on the other side of him.
I've tried.
And I wouldn't wish that. No, I don't think he goes too far on anything else apart from the Iraq War. I think...
Okay, so... Okay, so really you don't... Okay, that's interesting, because...
Yeah.
Well, I agree with you, but I was under the impression that, you know, we talked about one of my favorite lines in his book, which I really shouldn't say in a public forum, but I will.
No, we don't... Okay.
No, you don't want to go there.
I know what that one is.
Read his book. But it is an interesting line, and I'll be happy to.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Which is where he discusses what he says. What he says is the motto of the Roman Catholic Church, which is "No child's behind left." And okay, now are you sorry you asked? You don't think he went too far with that?
Well, with that line,
okay, let's bring it back, because I know we're actually going to be getting ready for the question period in a minute from everyone else. But this symposium is about education in some sense. And it's interesting to me that you said that you really, your purpose is to destroy religion. Is that really your purpose?
No.
I don't think it really is.
It was an interesting piece of contrarian reasoning to what you were saying, because you were saying you don't have to be an atheist to believe in evolution, and that, of course, is exactly. Then I tell people to go and read Ken Miller, Francis Collins, and indeed any reputable clergyman. But if a larger view is that the presence or absence of a God in the universe is, I mean, that's a huge question. I think it's a scientific question. I have a view on it, and I try to raise consciousness about it. Then, if it's true that there are lots and lots of people who think that evolution is incompatible with religion, and I actually do think it is, you see. I actually do think it is. But even if I didn't, if I were a propagandist trying to destroy religion, I would seize on that, because it doesn't follow that because there are people who think that that if you believe in evolution, you've got to be an atheist. Therefore, the obvious conclusion is to say, oh, no, you don't have to be. You could do it exactly the other way around and say, yes, well, as a matter of fact, yes, you do have to be an atheist if you believe in evolution. And here's all the evidence for evolution, and you can't get away from it. Well, of course, that wouldn't go down well with Ken Miller or Francis Collins. But I could come back and give good arguments for why I think there actually is an incompatibility.
Yeah, well, sure, absolutely. But would you really have a hope of success if you're working against something that's instilled in children from the time they're very young, and it doesn't go into their brain, it goes somewhere else? So that
Probably not.
I think if you say to people, and I think it's an interesting idea, but if you say to people, yeah, you have to be an atheist to believe in evolution, you're not, because of that, because faith is so emotional, you're not going to get past that point, I think.
Well, I think that's right. And as a matter of fact, I do recommend Kenneth Miller's book to any religious person who writes to me. And so that's your answer. I mean, I do, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, I mean, and I knew you did. And I think that, I mean, presumably, well, let me ask another question, maybe near the end, but and then you can ask me one at the end, I guess. When you were writing The Selfish Gene, which is your first book, I mean, the purpose was to explain the remarkable aspects of evolution. It probably wasn't, it probably had nothing to do with religion at the time.
No, of course. I mean, my main purpose is science and the education in science. I suppose there's a slight difference in that I do think the existence of God is a scientific question. I'm not one of those I don't go along with Steve Gould on that. I mean, I think it is a scientific question.
Well, yeah, and in fact, I've argued in this country that plays into the hands of people like the Discovery Institute who try and claim it's a scientific question.
Yes, I know.
And, but I think that and this is probably where we both agree, and maybe it's a good time to go to the questions, unless you have something pressing you want to ask me. You wrote The Selfish Gene, and I've written my books because we find the real world so amazing that it'd be better if more people knew about it. And I guess, and part of my reason there is somewhat the same as yours, are not so much focused against incorrect beliefs, but I actually think the world would be a better place if we were willing to understand, just accept it for what it is. And without fear and without terror, and that would, if that governed public policy, just to say public policy and our life will be based on accepting the world for what it is without preconception and fear, then the world would be a better place.
Absolutely. I couldn't, I mean, I can't disagree with that. My whole life has been devoted to explaining science because it's wonderful. I mean, here we are on this planet, and maybe the only planet in the universe where there is anything capable of understanding why it's there. Our brain may be the only object in the entire universe that has the capacity to understand, to internalize the universe in the sense of setting up a model of the universe. So it is an amazing privilege to be alive, to be capable of understanding, to be alive in the 21st century when understanding of the universe and of life is far, far greater than in any past century. We should make the most of that, and those people who are deprived of the opportunity to learn about how wonderful reality is, it's simply tragic that they should go to their grave missing out on the opportunities that an understanding of science, not the practice of science necessarily, not Bunsen burners and things, but understanding the scientific method and understanding what an enormous amount is known, and the challenge of how much is not known.
Exactly.
And how much there is still work yet to do.
Yeah, and we give people the impression that scientists really want to, and in fact, the people use that who are countering science all the time. They say scientists, they just want to, they have this picture and it's a story. First of all, that's the first thing they tell about science. It's a story. It's not a story. It's more than a story. It makes predictions, and that's vitally important. But they want to have this little bit of knowledge, and they don't want it to be attacked. When in fact it's exactly the opposite. The thing that drives scientists forward, certainly drives me and everyone else I know, is actually the stuff we don't understand. And moreover, it's not as if we want to always agree with our colleagues, because the way you get famous is by proving them wrong. And that's what you go into work every day, is you want to prove all your colleagues wrong. And in fact, getting back to education, to me, the one thing that I hope every student has at some point in their life, and I tell this explicitly, and I think it's really profoundly important, the one experience that I hope you have in either high school or college or somewhere in your education is to have some belief that you profoundly, deeply hold proved to be wrong. Because that is the most eye-opening experience you can have, and as a scientist, to me, it's the most exciting experience I could ever have. So
I think we should switch to two questions.
Maybe I'll take the prerogatives with what you ended with and ask. I mean, there was a lot of discussion about evolution, per se, as being the thing that's most heart-wrenching people, because it's something that they don't like the idea that they share their ancestors, sea slugs and bacteria. But I would say that maybe the most fundamental question is there a purpose to the universe? And do you think that it's reasonable, as long as our species exists, that someday we'll be able to answer that question?
do you want to start, or should I? I'll start. Okay. Give you time to think about it, because I talk without thinking, which is easy. But I think it's, and this has come to me over time. In fact, I think what I would have said would be much closer to Richard if I hadn't had the experience of actually debating the head of the Intelligent Design Network in St. Louis. And he was actually one of the few people in that whole program who actually believed what he was doing and believed in what he was doing. It wasn't just a con job. And he said, look, you know, scientists really are trying to destroy our faith. And he presented a letter from 50 Nobel laureates about evolution, about what happened, and that there is no evidence of purpose or design in life. But the letter then went on to say, and therefore there was no purpose in design. And he pointed to this example, and it really hit me. Yeah, he's right, because that second statement, I don't believe, is a scientific one. I think it's a philosophical statement. It's a philosophical statement that I happen to, that resonates with me. But as Carl Sagan once said, and he stole it from someone else, evidence of absence is not, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And so there may be no evidence for purpose in the universe, but that doesn't imply that there is no purpose in the universe. It's a question that you can have a feeling about and still do the science and have very different views about. And so when you make the second statement, it's fine to make it. But I think you have to say that maybe you're being informed by your lifetime of scientific experience, but it's not, I don't believe, a scientific statement. And I think it's very difficult to know, and I happen to think we'll never, because it's not a question you can answer in the negative, I mean scientifically. The absence of evidence of purpose will never prove that there is no purpose, and I'm sure, I know Richard has a very good example of how ridiculous that statement can be, going back to Bertrand Russell, so maybe you'll want to talk about it, but it could be answered in the positive. That's the point. If tomorrow or tonight, because I'm here and not in Cleveland, I could look up and see stars, if tonight the stars spelled out, I am here, then I think most scientists say, you know, there's something there. And so positive evidence is certainly possible. Negative evidence is not. And so you have to, at that point, you're subject to philosophy. And I don't think science can make a definitive statement about that. But maybe you want to.
I think that's the first time this evening I really disagreed with this.
Oh, good.
Lawrence.
Okay.
I mean, unless you think there is a supernatural being in the universe, which neither of us do, what could purpose in the universe possibly mean? I mean, what would it look like? What would it be? Why would we even want to use a word like purpose of the universe? It seems to me obvious that it's linked to a theological belief. Now, in my own field of biology, we use the word purpose in a sort of metaphorical sense. There's purpose in a bird's wing and purpose in an eye, and these are the illusion of purpose is built up by natural selection in a way that's very well understood. But if you ask what's the purpose of a mountain, or what's the purpose of the universe, or what's the purpose of time, or what's the purpose of space, it's not just meaningless, it's stupid.
Well, no, this has come home. We didn't get a chance to talk about it, but in my own field of cosmology, which is sometimes turning into philosophy, there are these questions are kind of asked in different ways because we are taking seriously the notion that there may be many different universes, and with many different laws of nature, and what distinguishes this one from the others, and why do we live in this one? And I'm happy to. I won't talk about it now, but we're addressing those questions, and the purpose of the universe could be very blasé. For example, it turns out the universe doesn't have what's called topology. It could, or at least not evidence. So it could have lots of holes and all sorts of interesting things in space. It doesn't. But some mathematicians showed that if the universe was geometrically open and had topology, you could build a Turing machine with the universe. So I like to think that maybe the universe was in such a universe would be created to calculate pi to 100 decimal places. And maybe that's the purpose of the universe, and so that would be.
No, I mean, I'd be very happy to I mean, maybe we are all in somebody's computer simulation. Maybe we're all, maybe the entire universe that we're in is the product of a purposeful design of an alien intelligence which has put us into a simulation. That's absolutely fine. I've no problem with that. But you have set yourself to an enormous extent away from, I mean, that's equivalent to saying a sort of grand God of some sort. And I don't have an objection to that. But assuming you don't believe that, then I don't understand why you would even want to ask the question, what is the purpose of the universe?
And in fact, we've got to go to this question in a second, but let me just say one last thing. And that's part of the problem and that to some extent I've had. Because I agree with you, and I think it's so unimportant an issue that instead of spending a lot of time focusing on it and focusing on people's beliefs about purpose or whatever, it's much more productive to talk about other things. And that's one of the reasons why I don't dwell on it.
Mm. Okay. Let's go to...
I'm very thankful for you gentlemen for what you do. And I raised a great question of why I find purpose in the universe. I do have a quibble with you, and that is with respect to awe and wonder. Awe and wonder, I believe, were the greatest tools in the origin, propagation, and promotion of religion. And I don't think that, I know religion very much emphasized all that. That's the reason they go to funerals, that's the reason they monopolize all forms of entertainment during the Middle East. Today, we have the most boring entertainment you can imagine on television, on many channels, every day. The public And to survive, we need to know the facts. And I'm very tired of constantly trying to move up entertainment and emotions. Emotions were, in the words of the universe for animals, they were survival mechanisms. For us, emotions are destructive mechanisms. So I hope that you can imagine that you're going to defend science and not trying to tell people this is awesome.
I mean, I vehemently disagree. I suppose that you do too. But I think that if you think about whatever field it is that you do and what interests you, it's because you like it. And that's an emotion. And in fact, for me, the greatest thing that I want to tell kids about is that science is fun. It's actually interesting, it's fun, it's exciting, and it's pleasurable. And if that's the one, because that's not the impression that many people have. And I think it is, in fact, the reason that every colleague I know of who's a scientist is doing what they're doing is not to save the world. It's because they enjoy it. It's fundamental, and that's what I tell kids. I think we do it because we enjoy it, and in fact, you can find it enjoyable.
At the beginning of the talk, you talked about the hole that was out there, and one of the things was, does the Earth move around the Sun in the course of the year? I think you'll agree there are a couple of problems with that statement. First of all, the Earth doesn't go around the Sun. The Earth and the Sun go around a common center of gravity. And secondly, what is a year? Sidereal year or calendar year is what? It seems to me that 12% of people misunderstood the question and voted, yes, it does. What percentage of people were accurate and said, no, that's the wrong statement?
Well, that could be. I failed a driver's test once because I interpreted the questions too deeply. I'm not sure that's the case in this.
Hi, my name is James Lewis, and I read an article on the internet that I was interesting in. I hope you guys could respond to it. One of the things that posited was that the theory of evolution, like there's an intellectual jump that you have to make to get it, and then there's consequences which are really threatening people's beliefs. And so the suggestion that the gentleman had was that maybe you could try to teach them something that is similarly unintuitive, but doesn't have the same threatening aspects to their beliefs. And the thing that he cited, not as an instance of evolution, but just something that was similarly unintuitive, was Wikipedia. Like Wikipedia, I mean, it's a very strange idea. You have anyone edit something, and you would think that garbage would come out. And instead, you actually get something that is really useful. So I was just wondering if there's any, if you think that's a good idea, or if there's any other similar things that you can use that get people to hone these unintuitive ideas to get them to step into the idea of evolution, kind of in a more step-by-step approach that isn't as threatening. Thank you.
I'd like to pay tribute to Wikipedia. When I was first told about it, my immediate reaction, well, obviously that won't work. I mean, it's just a ridiculous idea that people could actually go in and edit. And then I went in and had a look, and I looked up something that I know something about. And I was astounded at how good it was. Yeah. And I tried the experiment of altering something. It actually needed to be altered. I looked up natural selection, because I know a little bit about that, and it was an almost perfect article. It was really, really, really good. But there was one thing that stood out like a sore thumb, which was a recommendation of a book, which had nothing whatever to do with natural selection, but maybe there was one sentence in it that had something to do with natural selection. But clearly, a book that didn't belong in an encyclopedia article on natural selection. So I removed the reference. And next day it was back. So I removed it again, and I think within minutes it was back. But these examples are relatively rare, and so I do think it's an astonishingly counterintuitive feat of human achievement. But the question I asked, the interesting question, could you, I take it you mean soften up people to evolution by pointing to something which is less threatening, which might be equally hard to understand. I don't quite see why Wikipedia would do that, but as you were talking, I did think that perhaps one way to do a bit of seduction, not quite in Lawrence's way, but in a different way, rather than trying to seduce people by saying evolution is fully compatible with your religion, which I don't think it is, to say evolution is not a handbook of immorality and violence. It doesn't lead to Hitlerism. It doesn't degrade humanity to be related to other apes. I say other apes because, of course, we are apes. We're not just descended from apes. So maybe that's a kind of seduction technique I could buy into. I wouldn't have to compromise my principles by saying evolution is compatible with your supernaturalist hogwash. But what I could say is evolution is fully compatible with your morality, with the fact that you don't steal, you don't kill, and you're not a racist. All these things could be done with a sufficiently sophisticated interpretation of evolution, I have to add, not a naive interpretation. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk today. I have, I guess, a question for each of you. If the majority of Americans don't believe in evolution, and it's true that they don't, and the majority of Americans go to school, you can see where the standing lies, but it can't just be that people start going to church and then it's too late for the school to educate them, because so many people convert to religion as adults. And it's my understanding that all Southern Baptists are required at a certain age to say, oh, I don't believe in all this, whatever it is, nonsense. So that can't be the issue. And my question to you, I guess more Professor Dawkins, because you're both going back to England, I know you're not political strategists, either one of you, but I'm becoming increasingly frightened in this country that in order to run for a political office, one has to declare his or her religious bona fide.
No, I agree with that entirely.
I honestly don't know what to do. I mean, if either of you has a suggestion, I would love to hear it.
Well, as you say, I'm not an American, and I have to be a bit careful treading in this field, not that I often am. But it is certainly very noticeable that American politicians cannot make a speech without mentioning God. British politicians cannot ever mention God when making a speech. There are religious British politicians. Tony Blair is a very religious man, just been indeed received, would you believe, into the Roman Catholic Church. But whenever challenged to wear his religion on his sleeve, he would retreat hastily. And he was challenged by Jeremy Paxman, who's Britain's most aggressive television interviewer. He said, in a kind of sneering way, "Is it really true, Mr. Blair, that you actually pray with George Bush?" and Blair said, no. So there is something different about the way politicians are trained by their minders and their spin doctors to address their public, because everybody believes that the United States is a nation of religious maniacs. I'm not sure that I do believe that. I think that this country has been maligned. I don't think it's as bad as all that, anything like. And I think it's up to people who don't take a religious view to stand up and be counted and perhaps form lobby, because the other side is very, very good at lobbying. And what politicians really respond to is not so much a perception of what the total number of people who believe in such and such a thing is. They get systematically lobbied by special interest groups. And so there's the Irish lobby, and there's the Jewish lobby, and there's the steel lobby, and there's the coal lobby, and the oil lobby and things. And these are powerful, well-financed interest groups. And so maybe what the godless among the American population need to do is to recognize that they really are a very substantial proportion of the population, and behave as if they were. As you know, organizing atheists has been likened to herding cats, which is a compliment in a way, but it doesn't help to get results in the political sphere.
Well, you know, part of the problem with that, though, and I've been involved in political campaigns in a number of different ways in this country, and one of the challenges we've had to trying to create this science debate between the presidential candidates, which is scheduled, by the way, for April 18th in Philadelphia at the Franklin Institute. Now, you can applaud, but it's scheduled, but none of the candidates have yet agreed to do it. So you should write the candidates, and they need more pressure. We're to the point where I think it may happen, but the more pressure they can get, the better, because particularly the problem with atheists being a lobby or scientists being a lobby, one of the reasons that it doesn't work very effectively is that unlike some lobbies, they don't float as a bloc.
Well, quite. I think that's the problem.
But you know, I don't think that's ever going to happen. Even if scientists disagree with the science policies or funding policies of a candidate, they usually don't make that a monolithic reason for voting. And because the politicians realize that they won't vote as a bloc, and I think probably for good reason they won't vote as a bloc, they tend to ignore them. And so I think it's pretty hard to take people who by nature don't have one overriding idea, which is going to, you know, be the one reason you vote for a candidate, which is, on the fundamentalist case, I think is much easier to imagine people voting specifically.
Yeah. You don't mean block, do you? You mean a one issue.
Yeah, one issue. That's the problem, and they don't vote as a one issue thing. But also, one of the things I want to say is that this is a fascinating, it's not my idea, it's a historian, but it's fascinating to me, is one of the reasons people say, why is this such a big deal in the United States and not in other countries? Well, first of all, now it is. And when I first spoke about this in Europe, they said, this is Americans. But it's getting there, because the United States exports everything, good and bad, and it's happening in England, in Holland, in France, in all sorts of countries. But one of the things that's been really remarkable that was pointed out is that one of the reasons that religion is so successful here, it would be better if we didn't have a separation of church and state, if we had a state religion. Because if you have a state religion, everyone ignores it, like in England. And it becomes impotent, because capitalism just works. And so we've forced religions in this country to become entrepreneurial, and they've been incredibly successful because of it. So if we just had a state religion, then it'd be fine. Then no one would want to talk about it anymore.
I think there's a lot in that. I mean, you've no idea how boring the Church of England is in
This question is inspired by recently watching Jesus Camp, which is all about indoctrination.
Terrifying movie to watch.
A child who's
yeah.
on an apostle faith, and also something that you discussed about how we reach children. So I want to, maybe this is that line of reasoning, but I want to ask, what about popularizing the teaching of evolution even farther than it is, like say Darwin camp or the people. Is there a line where you try and reach people that are art on their kids in the same way that the opposition is? I mean, Tim LaHaye can sell 60 million copies of the Rapture and the Times book. Should there be Darwinian novelists with Charles as your protagonist?
Well, I think no, absolutely. In fact, you know, I was a judge at the Sundance Film Festival specifically because the Sloan Foundation gives a prize for trying to introduce, not to have a science documentary, but trying to introduce scientific themes in full-length feature films or scientists, you know, to humanize them. And I absolutely think that we really have to do a much better job, and I try personally whenever I can, to bridge what is a gap between science and culture. That science is not viewed as a part of our culture, and it should be viewed as that. And I really think we should be working to have science a much more integrated part of all of our culture and celebrate it in schools and, in fact, in churches and in literature. But I would hope scientists would, on the other hand, never stoop to the child abuse that is in Jesus Camp. I mean, what we should be encouraging kids to do is to have fun, to keep their minds open, to want to explore, to want to ask questions, and then the rest will follow. I don't think we should ever say, And if you don't believe in Darwin, you're going to go to hell. I mean, you know.
Well, you laugh, but I mean, that's what they do. And so I mean, it just brings up the comparison. I have an ambition at some point in my life to write a children's book about evolution. And I really don't, it comes back to the thing we were first discussing, it shouldn't be that difficult to explain. I don't understand, I think we talked about this as well, I don't understand why evolution is left to the end of scientific education. Yeah. It should be at the beginning, because then everything makes sense. And I don't know about camp, why not camps? I mean, I don't come from a culture where children do get sent off to camp, but it sounds rather a nice thing to do. I would love to try to teach evolution at a children's.
When I was a kid, there were, I mean, I essentially went to things called, like, they were essentially like science camps. So they weren't like Jesus Camp, but they were places where you could, you know, do science and have fun and explore and do visits to places. And that's a good thing. But I think, I wanted to ask, actually in that regard, I wanted to ask you, it's interesting that evolution is taught at the end of biology class, because there was, I forget which famous biologist said, nothing in biology makes sense without evolution.
It was Dobzhansky,
yeah.
but any biologist would say that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I wanted to ask if one of the things that's really scary to me in this country, and my daughter went to a rather liberal school, private school, but her teacher, and this is where they've been really successful, even if they haven't distorted the curriculum, they've instilled enough fear in teachers that there are many teachers in this country, biology teachers, who won't mention the word evolution, not because it's not there, but they're just afraid. And even in my daughter's school, I remember her biology teacher basically apologized each time he mentioned the word evolution. I was just shocked, but it happens.
Well, all right, I mean, that's a major evil. What are we going to do about it? It's terrible. That's absolutely terrible. That teachers are being intimidated. I mean, are there any teachers here who can testify to that by any chance? Yeah.
Yes, there's one in front. I can't
say.
So,
are you being intimidated by children, by parents, by other teachers, by what? Parents.
Well, you know, but it's even more to me. You know what happened in Texas. So the school board official recommended there was an event on evolution, a bunch of interesting speakers, and the school official and the school board sent out the notice that this event was happening, and she got fired because she didn't present the other. She didn't talk about the other side. Could you believe that? But that's the kind of intimidation that actually happens, and it's really scary.
Well, I don't know if there's anything I can do to help, but I kind of feel the need to do something.
Hi, my name is Krauss. I'm a physics graduate student. Thank you both very much for coming. I admire you both very much as evangelists of science.
As Steve Weinberg says, we're doing God's work. But anyway.
I think one of the problems that scientists have in evangelizing science is the fact that the field of science is so large and complex. You can spend a lifetime studying even a small area and not understand all of it. And I think one of the things that we have to do to sell science is to present it in a coherent and compact way and tell stories about science that are accessible to people. And you've both written lots of books, some of which I've read, you're both fantastic writers. I think, though, that books have a limited audience. And I think the medium that will reach a lot more people is actually film. So I think that another great evangelist for science, Al Gore, who had written books and given lots of speeches, I think really came into prominence and raised the consciousness of our nation about climate change with this movie. So my question is, and Professor Dawkins, I watched your Virus of Faith film aired by the BBC, which I thought was very good.
Sorry, which film?
It's called Virus of Faith.
It may have had a different name here in the U.S.
Channel 4 in England.
You don't remember doing that?
Well, the phrase is mine, but I don't remember making a film about it.
That was very good. You should look it up. My question is, would either of you, in collaboration with other scientists, consider making a science creation film
that tells the story of science from the Big Bang to now, talking about cosmology, galaxies, the history of life on Earth, the history of hominids, and putting it into something that's presentable to people and can be watched in the movie theater.
Well, I think I know. Yeah, I agree. It'd be great, and I'd love to do it. If there's anyone with $20 or $50 million here who'd like to contribute, I think. I mean, both of us do TV. Richard does more film than me in England, I think, and you're absolutely right. The books reach a limited audience, and I don't think film. I actually think television reaches the broadest audience, and it really saddens me. And I've had it happen. I talk to TV producers a lot. I'm on a lot of TV programs in different ways. But I really would love to get on a mainstream, not the Science Channel, because that's a self-selecting group, or not the Discovery, or a lot of those places where I normally appear. But in a regular program, it's extremely difficult to convince them that and because it's all driven by ratings and money. And the perception of network executives is that science will not draw people in, and it is it's a ridiculous perception, because if done right, it could be an incredible draw, but that's a very difficult thing to overcome, and I'm hoping that we can slowly try and overcome it, and I'm trying to do it, but it's a difficult job. I don't know whether you want to.
As you say, it costs an enormous amount of money, and there have been 3 very, very major series that I can think of. One is Carl Sagan's Cosmos. One is, David Attenborough's entire corpus, which is unparalleled, and the other is Jacob Bronowski and The Ascent of Man. And it doesn't look as though the big television companies are putting money into these sort of epic scale.
It's just impossible now. The cost has become so great. Cosmos would never be produced today, I think. And it's sad, but the costs have escalated, but they're great. I agree. I mean, Bronowski's series to me is just, and if you compare, and it is amazing, because without many special effects, it is riveting. And I was at a conference recently of TV producers where I brought that a clip from that in compared to a clip in a modern science production that I won't mention. On the same subject, which had all this animation and everything else, and Bronowski was much more riveting. And I just think, again, we somehow have to convince. It's like politicians. You can only get them to act if you convince them that the electorate cares. And we haven't really convinced them that the electorate cares about science issues. Okay. And I think the only way to get the networks to act is to convince them that there's an audience. And it's a chicken and egg thing, but it's going to take a while. But I certainly hope that we can do it, and I'm going to keep trying anyway.
Hi, my name is Mark Bertel, and I'm a reality evangelist. Reality changed my life, and it can change your life too. I'm also a seduction time. I think that being pro-reality is much more effective in winning souls for Darwin than being anti-fiction. And atheism only gets you from negative up to 0. But if you're pro-reality, then you go on into positive, numbers. And I have found that when I talk to religious people, that they're much more interested in what I believe in rather than what I don't believe in. And I think that, I'm excited about reality. If it wasn't for reality, I wouldn't be here today.
Well, it's not so clear, but anyway.
Yeah. This part of this is much better than other forms where I've seen Richard Dawkins, where the main focus is talking about reality rather than talking about what isn't real.
Okay, well that was a comment.
I'll take that as a comment, I think.
Me too. Yeah.
Well, first I would like to thank you both for this very interesting conversation. I would also point out, there's been mention several times of perhaps a summer camp teaching evolution, critical thinking, and there is such a camp. There are a number of camps across the country called Camp West.
Quest.
I'm really sorry. Quest. Camp Quest is the name of it, and Camp Quest West
It's a California version of it. You can find it online, and they do teach free thinking club. My question has to do with the statement which both of you have used, which is that you don't have to be an atheist to believe in evolution. I wish you would discuss the use of the phrase "believe in." We don't believe in facts. They are facts. You have pointed out that, and most of us do understand evolution to be a fact. Belief has such a theological tone to it and allows for not believing. And so my question is that word.
Yeah, no, in fact, our mutual friend Eugenie Scott is here somewhere, I think, from the National Center for Science Education, and she always reminds me that I should never use the word believe in a scientific context, and you're absolutely right.
Yes, I quite agree with that. I mean, who was the famous philosopher who, when informed that a lady had said, "I accept the universe," and he said, "By gad, she'd better."
Yeah, my question is, when science is used to social issues, that I mean, the science, I feel the same issues that you guys are facing, but you, for several times, proved that if you, then consciousness, belief, those are all social issues. We are human, we are social beings.
Could you stand a bit further away from the microphone?
So, my question to you, especially to Richard Dawkins, you mentioned that you want to spread science education. The question to me is how do we spread science to the children? Because that's when the mind is very fertile and very receptive. And I see, if you consider as an analogy computer, their main memories are still empty. So that makes primary time to give them the science education and also to other media. For example, Sesame Street. Why can't she make popularization of science and give evolution as a science teacher, not as belief, faith, or this particular stuff? Can you comment on that? How do you promote science and make understand science as a science, not as a social, resolving social issues?
I didn't really hear.
I think she was basically trying to say, how can you teach science as science instead of as a social issue? And
it never occurred to me it was a social issue. Who thinks science is a social issue? Is it?
Well, I mean, obviously, for most of the public, they view the evolution intelligent controversy as something that affects their daily life and not so much as a scientific issue. But well,
no, I agree.
Let me turn it around, and maybe you can comment afterwards. But you know, obviously, I think science, and that's what's really important. And I've used lots of examples, and I won't. In fact, there's one example I used in the dialogue with Richard that I won't repeat here about the Big Bang as being a scientific issue, not a social one. But at the same time, let me put it around the other way and say I'm worried that more people don't know that science, that some basic literacy in science is vitally important for social issues. And the example I want to use, and the reason when I wrote my piece in the Wall Street Journal a while ago calling for a science debate was when Mr. Huckabee at the time, as you'll remember during the debates, all of you know that he was one of 3 people who said, I don't believe in evolution. But what was more upsetting to me was the statement that he made in the next debate, which was, I'm running for president. I'm not running to write an 8th grade science curriculum, so why should it matter whether I know the Earth is 6,000 years old or not? Okay? And what really upset me was not that statement, but the fact that a poll the next day of the American public, everyone agreed with him. I mean, a majority of the American public agreed with him. And the thought to me that you could be scientifically illiterate and yet be prepared to tackle the problems of this country, we wouldn't accept someone who didn't know the Holocaust happened, for example, or didn't know enough history to know anything about that as having enough perspective to make rational decisions. Yet we're perfectly comfortable with people proclaiming, not just admitting, but proudly proclaiming their scientific literacy, and yet allowing them to make vitally important issues, judgments on social issues. So I don't want a scientist president.
It's not just a matter of needing science in order to make judgments of things where science is relevant, because of course science is relevant all the time. It's that somebody who is going through life on this planet without having a comprehension of why he's here, how he comes to be here, what the planet is, what the universe is. I mean, how can you live your life in ignorance of the world in which you live and expect to be a full human being capable of governing other full human beings? It isn't just that a scientifically ignorant president will make wrong decisions about issues such as global warming or abortion or something like that. It's more that you wouldn't wish to be governed by somebody who, I don't know, thought he lived on a flat earth, or was just completely divorced from reality in that kind of way. It's an indication that this man is thick. He's stupid.
Are you talking about anyone in particular? No. But let me just say also, to add to that, it's more than that. It's not only a tragedy, it's criminal, that these are the most interesting, among the most interesting and fascinating intellectual achievements. Again, forget the practicality. The ideas that science has exposed, and it's just criminal and sad to think no more than would we want to have a child grow up without having some understanding of, some exposure to them, then we would want a child to never be exposed to Shakespeare.
Exactly. One of the stupidest things Sherlock Holmes ever said was more or less the first thing he said to Dr. Watson. He divulged in conversation with Watson that Holmes didn't know something about the names of the planets, I mean Jupiter and Saturn and things like that. And Watson was absolutely shocked, and rightly so. And Holmes said, "But Watson, I don't need to know about the planets in order to solve my criminal cases." That is such a short-sighted view. Well, Conan Doyle was, as you know, believed in fairies, so.
Positive side effect of that, the evolution, and these other questions are in life science in the U.S., which is that we have doctors, social scientists, lawyers, for whom their definition of themselves and their statement of their beliefs is very much tied up with science. So anecdotally, if you compare my experience, if you compare this to the dogmas of my experience, you find when talking to a doctor or a social scientist, in other words, an educated layperson, that they find these topics much less interesting and much less part of their day-to-day experience, even if they got a good science education in school. So how do you maintain that sort of live fire within the non-scientist's heart for science once you've settled the stupid question?
No, I mean, for me, that comes back to what I said before. Before someone will listen to you, you have to get them to be interested. And I think the big problem, maybe it's not a problem, but for many people, they just don't find the questions interesting. And I think, if I thought the questions weren't interesting, I wouldn't be doing it. But what I found is if you find the right way to seduce someone into being interested in those things, then the well opens up, and it's just a sea of questions because they are basic issues. Where do we come from? Where are we going? Are we alone in the universe? What are we made of? And so I think one has to just overcome the tragic de-education that we do in this country. I mean, here's a scary statistic. So we compare American students to their counterparts in 20, 25 other industrialized nations. And there was a recent study that you may have heard came out. So we look at kids in grade 3 and grade 5 and then 15-year-olds. And what's amazing is in grade 3 and grade 5, American students on the whole do better in science and mathematics than their counterparts around the world. But by the time they're 15, they do substantially worse. So we've been doing something very effective to de-educate them or disinterest them in science. And one of the reasons is another equally scary fact, which is that over 90% of middle school science teachers in this country have never taken a science course outside of high school. And
what percentage was
over
that?
90%.
90?
90, yeah.
Not 9.
No, 90. And I saw it happen to our daughter when she was in school. In grade 2, I remember going into her school, you know, and I mean, what do you do in grade 2? It's light during the day, dark at night. I mean, those are the kind of things you're talking about. But the teacher was terrified, and that could not help but but get across to the students that it was scary, it was terrifying, it was complex. And so it is, I think, a problem that we convince our students, partly because we have people teaching who don't feel comfortable with it, that they should feel uncomfortable and interested. And, you know, and you could do very well. I taught at Yale University for what seemed like an eternity. And I learned that you know, you can be very successful in this world with not only just being scientifically literate, but proudly proclaiming it. And it's unfortunate. It really is.
Hi, I have one comment. We have talked about how to reach to the other side. Professor Krauss mentioned that faith is an emotional thing, and many people who go to church have been brainwashed right from childhood to reject emotional culture, to reject evolution. How about this approach? As you mentioned, nothing in modern biology or science or life makes sense without evolution. So those who reject evolution are hypocritical if they go to hospitals and take modern medicine.
Well, they would deny that, actually, because they...
Everything in modern medicine comes out of evolution. Can they show one development which has been made without evolution, without the bedrock of evolution? I mean, they should read the Bible instead of going to the hospital.
And obviously, I'm very sympathetic to that. There was a cartoon to that effect, which was going the rounds of the internet. How did it go? It was a fellow in a doctor's office, and the doctor was warning him about antibiotic resistance. I'm not going to remember it. Do you remember this?
Yeah, no, I'm trying to remember the...
Anyway, okay, forget it. It doesn't matter. Look it up. It's fun. But I think that if you were to talk to a creationist of, I was going to say any sophistication, but I'm not sure that such a thing exists. They would say something like, "Oh, we're quite happy with microevolution.
Yeah.
It's only macroevolution we worry about, and the mutation and selection of a pathogenic organism in a hospital, that's all microevolution." Unfortunately, they get a lot of aid and comfort from some circles in biology who add fuel to that by pretending that there really is a distinction between microevolution and macroevolution, instead of realizing that, as we've known since the modern synthesis, macroevolution is just microevolution going on for a very long time. And that's one of the problems that people have in understanding.
Well, I think to add to that, I mean, I've gotten in trouble because I've exactly written that, and not so much in terms of evolution, but I argued that if you say the Earth is 6,000 years old, you shouldn't drive a car, you shouldn't get in a plane, you shouldn't do anything, because you're being hypocritical, because all of these things depend. The thing is that people don't realize the connectedness of science, so it's okay. You know, they think it's just a bunch of separate stories, and that's often the way we teach it. And it's okay not to believe this part of the story, but you should believe that part of the story. But at the same time, the thing is, at some basic level, what always amazes me is no matter what people say, they ultimately realize that science is the way to go when it comes to concerns. For example, you know, President Bush said we should teach both intelligent design and evolution because we should teach students what the debate is all about. Now, that is not an intrinsically stupid statement, surprisingly, but it's actually quite rational. What it represents is ignorance, and not ignorance in a pejorative sense, ignorance of the fact that there is no debate. But the interesting thing is, when the avian flu became a big issue in this country, what you heard was the president say we have to quickly determine how fast it's mutating from birds to humans. You never heard one person in his administration say, you know, it's been designed to kill us. You know, just forget about it. So at some point, people understand that when really it comes to the crises, no matter what they say to pollsters and whatever, it's amazing to me that we're so bimodal or whatever that we can just sort of say, okay, we really need the science because it's the only thing that's going to save us.
You guys are up on stage because you're famous. You're famous because you have great ideas, but also because both of you are very good communicators. And I think you'd agree with me that most scientists are not very good communicators. Is that because science attracts people that are not very good communicators? Or is it because there's part of something in the scientific training process that makes people into that communicators? And regardless of the case, how can scientific education be changed to make people that are scientists
I don't think. Well, I think that's unfair. I don't think that scientists as a group are bad communicators. I think there are good communicators and bad communicators in any field. I do think that the scientific establishment should recognize communication skills as a virtue. It's said, I don't know with what truth, that Carl Sagan was denied fellowship of the National Academy of Sciences because other scientists were jealous of his success as a communicator. I hope that's not true, but if it is, then that would be an indication of what could possibly be wrong. It may be that in the scientific culture there is value, prestige, kudos given to a number of papers published in Nature and Science rather than, say, books selling well to the general public. So there is a prestige mismatch between what one would like to see and what is actually there. So maybe that organizations like the National Academy of Sciences and Britain, the Royal Society, and the grant-giving bodies should value communication more, because science does need public support. It's ultimately where the money comes from, after all. And scientists who really do bury themselves in ivory towers are doing their subject and themselves a disservice. But actually, if you go to conferences, scientific conferences, listen to graduate students presenting their research, many of them are brilliant at communicating. Really lucid, very clear, setting things out in the right order. This is the problem I'm faced with, these are the methods, and using imagery, using good language. There are plenty of excellent communicators among young scientists, and I think they just need official encouragement to get out there and communicate.
Well, actually, I want to turn that around a little bit, because yeah, there's the large-scale kudos one gets, as, you know, when you're a professional, but you got to reach that point. And the interesting thing is, I do think we do a tremendous disservice to students, because we don't instill the notion of communication. And in fact, we don't explain to them that you actually, a large part of succeeding as a professional scientist is in fact your ability to communicate. I've seen, I mean, as chair of a physics department for many years, and I've seen when we hire people, how people who are in some sense equally able get, one of the things that distinguishes, one of these things that determines sometimes whether we hire people are how well they communicate to us about their ideas. And I was on a visiting committee at MIT a few years ago, which was trying to do something really interesting. Right now, when we take our science, they were worried more about engineering students, but it works the same way. We require them, you know, to take some writing course, right? And the writing course is taught by some bozo they never heard of, right? I mean, from their point of view. We don't, and we should start to impose the requirement of writing and oral communication as a part of our physics courses and our engineering courses. Why? Because these students view the professors of physics and engineering as their mentors. Those are the people they care about. And if they're not telling them how important to communicate it is, then if they just have to take something from column B to get their degree, it doesn't matter. So what I really think we do have to do in our educational system is make students realize and make an important part of all of the curriculum, not just the writing part, but of a physics class and an engineering class and a biology class, that oral and written communication are incredibly important. Because in fact, for engineers, it's really true that their abilities to succeed as an engineer are not so dependent upon their intrinsic abilities as engineers as later on when they work in companies, how well they can convince their colleagues and how well they can make presentations. And we really do a disservice, I think, to our students not to indicate that their success in their own field in some ways relies as much on communication as it does on their other abilities.
I think that one of the American grant-giving bodies, it may be the National Science Foundation, at one point introduced a rule that when they gave money for a research grant, some proportion of that, of the grantee's time had to be given over to communicating their research to the general public. I forget whether, was that the NSF?
Well, the NSF, but I actually found, by the way, I have to say, I mean, again, I have some problems with that, because one of the things that was required is you have people who, young people, in their very first grant application, and they're just starting, they've never taught in their lives, and they have to give their teaching philosophy, and they have to talk about their outreach efforts, and frankly, they've never done it. And it's a good thing to do, but unfortunately, I think what one finds is that people tend to put in boilerplate, and it's probably too late. I mean, it's a good place to do it, but I think it's too late to start there. I really do.
Renal, it's unfortunate it's 4 o'clock and we're going to have to stop, but I really wanted to give a great round of applause for you today.
Thanks a lot.